My name is Beth Weinstein, and I develop events for New York Times subscribers. I am so happy that you're all here. How many subscribers are here? Oh, this is so exciting. I'm so happy you're here. So the programming that we like to present really gives you a window into the newsroom and the stories behind the stories. We strive to create a space for you to really engage directly with our journalists. And actually, this event, the Podcast Club series, is one of our signature programs, and it really shows how we're trying to bring all the amazing things that are happening inside the building out to you. So the Podcast Club series started as a brown bag lunch between colleagues. It was people from the newsroom and from product and developers and designers, and also marketing people who all really love podcasts. And they just kind of started this kind of informal lunch in a cafeteria just to kind of speak to one specific podcast each week. It was like a book club. And then it became a Facebook group, and now here we are. So we're so glad that you're here. We have lots of exciting stuff coming up that we will email you about tomorrow. We have a B-side series in 2 weeks at Le Poisson Rouge, where you'll hear from reporters from all different desks who play music together. So at night, they sometimes jam in different conference rooms. So you'll be able to hear them. And if you're a musician, you'll be able to bring your instrument and play with them. We have a conference call with Frank Bruni and Gail Collins that our subscribers are invited to, and many other things. So I really hope that we continue to see you. I hope we can continue this conversation on conference calls, in person, and at next month's Podcast Club. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Margaret Lyons. I'm a TV critic at the New York Times.
I'm Samara Freemark. I'm the senior producer of In the Dark.
And I'm Madeline Barron. I'm the lead reporter and host of In the Dark.
Welcome, guys. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, everybody, for coming out to Podcast Club IRL. So to get things started, before we get into the sort of nuts and bolts of the show, I wanted to talk a little bit about your backgrounds. And I'm curious how both of you guys got involved in podcasting in the first place.
By doing this podcast. I've never done a podcast before. So my background is just regular journalism. And I wasn't a radio journalist either starting out. So I started doing radio stories, radio investigative reporting, and then did our first podcast, season 1 of In the Dark.
And I worked at a place called Radio Diaries, which is actually in New York, which has a podcast now and did sort of audio documentaries for public radio. And then in Minnesota, I was working in the I was going to say the newsroom, which is not really true, but yeah, in the documentary side of NPR there.
How did you guys get involved with In the Dark? How did that sort of come about?
We made it.
We were.
But how did that, tell us the origin story.
Okay.
Story.
Like all origin stories, it's quite boring. It starts off with getting coffee, like all reporters do. We just got, I didn't actually know Samara very well, and so, but we went to get coffee one day, and I was telling her the story idea that I had. And I was, I think, less into it at the time than Samara was. And you were very into it, which was the idea that became season 1 of In the Dark.
Well, because we had both fairly recently moved to Minnesota. And one of the biggest stories in Minnesota ever was the abduction of Jacob Wetterling, who was this boy who was abducted many years ago. And when you move to Minnesota, people just talk about this story all the time. So I was familiar with this story, but on this coffee walk with Madeline, she started talking about how what she was really interested in was why this case hadn't been solved, which I had never heard anyone ask that particular question, which immediately shocked me. And so we started talking about it and decided that we should pitch it as a longer project.
Yeah. And then how did season 2 sort of come about, or how did the story come across your desk?
We, at the end of season 1, we sent out a call for ideas, and we got hundreds and hundreds.
Thousands.
Yeah, so many. Yeah, and they were all, emails, some phone calls even, DMs, all kinds of ways people are getting in touch with us. And a lot of the emails were really long and had all this details. And we had our couple of ideas of our own to consider. And then in all of that, there was one very simple email. It was like one of the shortest ones. And it was this woman who said, like, I live in this area in Mississippi, and there's this man there named Curtis Flowers who I think might be innocent, and he's been tried 6 times for the same crime. And as a reporter, when you get an email like that, your first reaction is like, well, that's probably not true. So, because like that sounds like too, you know.
Yeah, I mean, when someone's like, it's a podcast where someone got tried for the same crime 6 times, like, I'll be the judge of that.
Because you get a lot of tips like that, you know, like you get a ton of tips that are like, well, if that was true, that'd be fascinating. But, you know, and so you do like a quick Google search, like a due diligence type of search to put it in the, but it was true. And then we spent a few months reporting it before we even decided it was going to be season 2.
Yeah, and during that time we were reporting out several stories, actually trying to figure out what we wanted to focus on, and we just like couldn't stop thinking about the Curtis Flowers story. That was the one that we always just wanted to be working on,
and would secretly work on.
Right, when we were supposed to be working on the other ones. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I know that season 2 is still sort of like in process, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not like all the episodes are like in the can yet, are they?
Not even. No.
Okay, so how long have you been working on this as a story? And then is there do you have a vision of how long the story will sort of continue to take?
Yeah, so we've been working on this since February of last year. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. February of last year.
So, and now at this point, I mean, we're more or less done with our reporting. I mean, we're doing a little bit, but we're basically done. So for us, like we are, at the point where we release episodes, we're done with reporting. So now we're in, we're like still fine tuning like some edits and some additional writing and then production. But we know where it's going. So it's gonna be 10 episodes and we know where it ends.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious if the chronology of the way that the episodes are released or the sort of content of the episodes follows the chronology of the way you discovered that information, or if it follows what you think makes for a sort of more, like an easier to understand story.
Yeah.
I think it's a combination. To a certain extent, it is sort of the path of our reporting, but this is not really it's not really the story of us discovering things. I mean, that's a component of it, but it's really the story of what is happening in this place with this case. And so our particular chronology is not always the best way to line things up. So there's some parts of it that come in that order, but no, I think the story has its own structure that makes sense.
Yeah, because we go out and we report for like this story like more than a year, and then we come back with all this stuff, and then like the order, I mean, like so many things have happened at that point that it's almost like what you have to do is sort of clear away your own understanding of it and just like look at a dry erase board or go for a walk or something and be like, okay, if I have to tell this story in 5 minutes, what actually is it? And then it actually takes a while to get away from the things that you think are interesting that are not that interesting, or even the chronology that things happen to you in that it's actually not helpful. And so you're actually, I think you're trying to shake that a little bit when you're writing.
Yeah. As I was listening to the episode, then you mentioned that you moved to be closer to the reporting. Can you talk a little bit about that? I was surprised. That's an unusual thing for reporters to do. If you don't know a lot of reporters, that is relatively rare.
Yeah, we were lucky that we were able to do that. I mean, that's our whole team. So APM Reports does long form investigative and documentary work. So yeah, I mean, we couldn't have done this story, wouldn't have picked it, wouldn't have gone down that road at all if we couldn't have moved there. I think what was surprising to all of us was how long it took to report this story. So we planned to move there for the summer, and we did. And then it was like, this is like just beginning. And so you like kind of think like, when is the right time to tell my editor this fact, you know? But the team that we work on, like the editors we work on, it's never like an argument. It's always, that's what our team is here for. So we're in the right team for this kind of stuff. But yeah, so we moved down there and we lived in a bunch of places. We ended up renting a house for a while. And yeah, there's just not just me, but a whole team of people. So Samara was down there. Our other reporters and producers are down there. And so we were just all not always working on the same thing. So it would be like, you know, we'd like each like go out, you know, maybe like me and Natalie, one of our producers, we'd go out together. And then Parker, one of our reporters, would go out by herself getting records or whatever it would be. And then we'd all just kind of convene or not convene. We're keeping different hours. But yeah, and it was long. I mean, we were trying to find people mostly at their houses. I mean, most people down there either don't have phones or they don't really use phones at all, like not even for texting. So it's really hard to find people unless you just like go looking for people. So more than any reporting project I've ever done, it was just door to door, like every day. It's just door to door until it like got too dark to do it. It just was weird. And that was, so then the seasons you realize like you have less time.
Yeah, when
like
winter
you really
came,
miss
that
the
was brutal,
summer.
because like you had to stop at 4:30 and
really like
at
6
7.
maybe, but yeah.
So obviously, there are a lot of like genuine victims in this story, and I'm not trying to minimize or take away from the real suffering that is occurring. But I am curious about the headspace that you have to sort of stay in to report out a story that has this much suffering and injustice, and you know, like people were murdered, and there are people who are their parents. You know, how does that feel? How does it feel to sort of sit with that for as long as you guys, and as intensely and intimately as you guys did?
I mean, it's an intense thing that we're covering, but I mean, it's like you said, it's not. I should say first off, like it's not our pain directly, and I think that's a really important thing not to lose sight of. That the people we're talking to. We're talking to tons of people in this story who are actively suffering, and so just being cognizant of the fact that like their pain is not our pain, and our job is not to like take on their pain, but our job is to cast a light or to like show what's actually happening. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's how we always talk about it. I mean, it almost seems like silly in a way sometimes to even talk about. I mean, like, you know, we're going to interview people whose family members have been murdered. If you're trying to weigh how upsetting that is versus, you know, it's almost even hard to even do that. So I think that's part of just like having like real solid boundaries as a reporter, where it's like, no, you're not friends with the people you're reporting on, and you're not their therapist, and you can be like a very nice supportive listening person, but like you get to like go home and have that not be your actual family. You know, like that's not your story. Like it's your job to tell the story. It is not your actual story of your own life. And so I think that's helpful. And then, you know, like one of the advantages too of working on a big team like this is that we always can like check in with each other and be like, that was really hard. Not even in a long way, but you know, in these interviews, usually there's like 2 of us there. And so we can have like a minute of like, that was really intense, or let's like go do something else for a second or something like that.
How big is the team? You guys have said the team. I'm just curious, like actually just how many people that is.
Yeah, we have 5 of us full-time, and then we have other people on the APM Reports team who join us as editors or data reporters who jump in.
I'm curious, because like this is a podcast, the way that this podcast is formatted, like you guys are present. We do hear you talking, we hear like you conducting interviews, but we also like the connective tissue of the episodes is you. And I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about how you balance that and how you think about that. And as you're saying that you're not the story, but obviously like your perception of what's happening is like essential to how this hangs together as like for a listener. And I'm curious if you can just sort of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's like there's different roles that I'm playing, I think, in the story. Sometimes it's just like, here's a thing that happened to me, and it would just be weird to excise me from it, you know, like but then sometimes it's like I'm playing the role of the listener, where end up having a similar reaction that the listener might also have. Other times I'm explaining something, or very rarely sharing how I sort of consider something or view something. I don't know. Samara, you're the producer. You would have a better answer.
I think one thing that I like about our podcast is, you know, I think one thing I really strive to do, and I think we all really strive to do, is like show the process of investigative reporting to a certain extent, because I think one thing that sets our podcast apart is that I think we are doing really strong investigative reporting, and that's not that common in the podcast space. And so I want listeners to hear that. Like I want them to know what it looks like what responsible, ethical, investigative reporting looks like. And the only way you can show that is to like show what the reporter is actually doing.
And we also like to have like other people on our team in the podcast. So like when other people are doing stuff, people know. Like Will is our data reporter, and he's amazing. He comes in and tells us. or Natalie is out in the field with me, or Samara is out in the field, or Parker, Raymond, new people we added over the summer who are great. So we kind of do a little bit behind the scenes so you can get a sense of it.
And also I think there's hopefully there's this inherent drama in finding things out. I mean, that's like you have a question, it's not answered, and you go to find the answer to it, and you talk to some people and you get the answer, and there is drama to that. And so if you just take the answer that you find and you just present it to the listener and say, we learned that XXXXY, it is gonna, you're missing out, I think, on this opportunity to have this real moment of revelation. And so we were really trying to show that. But yeah, it is a balance, because we don't want to make it too much about us.
Yeah, the podcast should never, yes, we're always kind of going back and forth, is this too much here and not enough here? And in an edit, a common thing will be well, listener needs some more help here. Mm-hmm. There needs to be a little bit more explanation, or I think you've explained it enough. You can kind of dial it back.
So I'd love to throw it open to questions. We have people with microphones, and so because this is being broadcast, it's important to wait till you get the microphone, so not only everyone in the room can hear you, but anybody watching on Facebook can hear you as well. Does anybody have a question who wants to start us off? Brave soul will give you mad props for, there we go.
So my question is, how much does asking questions without the visual medium, without a camera, do you believe helps you free people up to answer you honestly, I guess, or from their truth?
Yeah, we thought about this so much.
Yeah, I mean, I've never reported with a camera, so I can't speak directly to it, but it does.
A documentary filmmaker would say, not at all, because I'm a great documentary filmmaker. Yeah. So I think it's we are not that. So yeah. For us, I think.
For us, it definitely feels that way. I mean, there is something,
does feel that way.
The microphone, to not have someone who's got something in front of their face, I think is helpful for people.
We've had people actually say, in Winona, that thing isn't a video camera, is it? Or it's not, it's just a very large, weird shaped microphone. And then even a woman I interviewed who I texted about the podcast coming out, she's like, I hope you didn't video record me. I'm like, I didn't. I've told you 10 times. That was just a microphone. But I think that, even with a microphone, though, anything that you start doing, or you open a notebook, anything where it's clear what's going, is something. But that's actually okay, because you want people to know that this is being documented, that this is not a casual, friendly conversation. it might be a casual conversation, but you're there as a journalist, so there's a way in which I think it can be helpful. And also, we do such long interviews that after a while, I think I don't know.
And also, I was going to say, we do, especially with this story, because we did so much just unannounced knocking on doors at weird hours, and people would open the door and they would be in their house dress, wearing slippers or with their a shower cap on or something. And if we had showed up with a video camera, they absolutely would have been get out, no way. But because there was no visual, they were okay to sit down with us. That happened all the time.
Plus, it's that takes the burden off of us to look presentable.
Yeah, that's true.
So that's so good.
Yeah. I think we got one back there.
I'm curious, you said you had over 1,000 submissions before you chose this one. Is there a factor when you think about this as a podcast, and when you have all these submissions, what could really work as a podcast versus, say something as a newspaper series, or I'm just curious, what goes into that process, and what you think makes a good story for a podcast?
Yeah, so what we're looking for, it's a good question, is a couple things. So the most important thing is, from an investigative journalism perspective, is, does a story matter? And so does a story matter, is it a high stakes story, not just for the people involved, but also beyond that? So is it raising larger issues that are important? So that's the first thing. So the story could be really fascinating, but it might not have that much significance to people outside the story, and then we wouldn't do it. So that's the first criteria. And then beyond that, we are thinking about what story has enough kind of turns and interesting things happening in it that it can sustain and requires this amount of reporting and this much time to tell the story. So there are some stories that we are considering that really would be fascinating as a 3-part newspaper story, or even or a 3-part NPR story. But for any kind of podcast or a longer form documentary, it just wouldn't. There wasn't enough stuff there, and it's not even a knock on the story. It's just we need we're looking for stories a really strong sense of place, really strong stakes,
And also stories where there's room for us to figure things out. Like if a
Yeah.
story has been either totally reported out or it just doesn't need to, if there's nothing left to find out, it's not a story for us because we're not doing a documentary. Like we're not just telling a good story in a different way. Like we work on an investigative team. APM Reports is an investigative team, so our mandate, like we have to find things out that no one knows or that like haven't been reported before, and so the story has to have the potential for that.
Yeah.
Over here.
First, thank you guys so much for coming out. Like, I've really enjoyed the podcast for season 1 and 2, and just incredible journalism. So my question is, you've talked a lot about this season, how race completely divides how people believe Chris Fowlers is innocent or guilty. Did you have any trouble getting the people of Winona to trust you as 2 white women going and like knocking, as you said, door to door, and answering questions and like spending hours with you two?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, the answer, interesting enough in Winona, and as a reporter, you're always this outsider. I mean, unless you're like a beat reporter and you know everyone. So there's a bit of that always. But we really felt it was an interesting reporting experience because we would go from feeling like very welcome, like people were like, finally someone's looking at this. And then other people who would say, well, that thing is so obviously correct and fine that like it's an insult that you'd even be down here. And so it really depended, and that split very racially, and not entirely, like I should say, like not entirely, like it wasn't like that was the case with every white person we talked to, but yeah, I mean there was a clear sense of that, and I think too, we're spending so much time that like living there a year. So for some people, like talking to us about some little thing is not really that big of a deal. But for other people, like primary people we interviewed, it actually took a long time in interviewing them to really figure out what we felt like we needed to figure out. And so like, when you have more time, you can just like I always sort of think about it like it's not rational to like show up at someone's door and be like, tell me your life story. That's like fundamentally bizarre like behavior. And yet like we have to sometimes do it as reporters, but for this type of stuff we actually don't. So we can, sometimes like just go and introduce ourselves. The thing that happened a lot in Winona is that we were there so long that we became like this like thing, like, oh, there goes like the public radio, or like not even that, like, there goes those like ladies that are in our town. It's like, it wasn't even public radio, it's just like those ladies. And like we were invited to places. People were, like a lot of people were very welcoming. And then we were just, we went to like football games. We got to this point where it was like we would like sit there like on like some Friday night football game and like look at the bleachers and think like, I've interviewed so many people at this football game, not about football. So I think it's just, and then like, and also about football. But being there for that long, then you realize like, oh, this person I was talking to is actually like her grandmother is this person I want to talk to, or something like that. And then we were invited to church a lot, and that was really helpful to like have people just know that we're like not total strangers then, like when we come knock on the door, like, oh, I think like this person looks familiar to me or something like that. But yeah, I think it's the main dynamic I think that was going on in this reporting was like, do you think that this story should be investigated or not? And that was really dictating the responses, if that makes sense.
Did I see one over here? Or great, back there.
Thank you for coming out. How do you prevent like an undercurrent of your bias from appearing in your journalism, in your presentation, in the facts?
Yeah.
Through
the
think about
facts.
that all the time.
Because like, we're reporting long enough that we don't have to guess about what's going on. So we report until we figure it out. And then once we figured it out, then we report it. If we don't figure it out, we don't report it. So like the word we're avoiding is speculation. And so I think that's part of it. Also, it's part of the editing process. And also there's just sort of like a cognitive process too that we will also undertake, which there's all these different ways to do this, but one of them is just to think, even really late in a reporting project, like what are the ways in which all of these things that I know are true are still true, but they add up to something else? Like, what is the explanation in which all these things make sense and no one did anything wrong? Or like, is there a possibility where the person I think did everything wrong, did everything right, and someone else did? And so you sort of get to like this middle point in your reporting where you're playing through these different scenarios and trying to sort of challenge yourself to reconsider what these facts might mean. But, and then we always report like well past what we might technically need to do, I think, to show a fact in a lot of cases. So like when we're talking about witnesses who saw Curtis Flowers walking around town that morning, I mean, we tried to talk to all of them. Now, like, did they all say things that were substantially different from each other? No. But we felt like we needed to talk to all of them to be able to say something about them so we're not missing something.
Yeah, I mean, I think having as much time as we have been given is such a blessing, and we're very lucky to have been given so much time and so much staffing to do this, because it allows us to report out to a place where we can make really strong statements.
And that's like what investigative reporting is actually about. So it's sort of frustrating if you were like to listen or watch or read a piece of investigative journalism that like spends all this time and then leaves it like, well, what do you think? Yeah. It's like, well, didn't you figure it out? Like, didn't you have no findings whatsoever? You know, like, so I think one of the features of like the work that we do is that we actually do try to, like, we don't shy away from a conclusion. Like, if we think that something is wrong, that's one thing. But if we prove that it's wrong, then we're not going to hide that fact.
Right. And we have editors who push us in that direction as well, which I think is not always the case.
Yeah.
Were there points that you guys hit while you were reporting this story where you were like, this is a real brick wall, or if we can't get through this part of it, then we're going to have to sort of move on, because this piece is so essential that if we can't sort of get to the bottom of this aspect of it, then this story we're not going to have solved it?
Like in general, like walking away from the whole thing?
Or if there was, if you thought we were going to have to take a dramatically different sort of, we were going to have to cover a much smaller scope of this or something, that were there moments while working on this season where it was like, ooh, this is real make or break?
I think it was more like, oh, there's this whole other thing, like there's like this other avenue we hadn't even been aware of yet, and now we're going to go report that, and that's really interesting, and now there's this other one. And then sometimes it's like something you thought was going to take a lot of time was really fascinating, turns out to not even be a thing, and like 2 days of reporting just it goes away forever, you know. So like the act of reporting, you really don't know. That's why until you do the reporting. And so with our team, it's never really a problem to have like to need to spend more time or to have another like development. And report. Yeah, I don't think we've ever like walked away from a.
No, because by the time we commit to the story, you know, it's a couple months process of real reporting to even get to the point where we're like, this is the story we're doing. And our editor is always asking like, what is the least possible story here? And so after we do our preliminary reporting, and we look at what we have just after a couple of months, and we say like, what is the least possible story? And if that story still seems worth telling, then like if you've hit that point, then you can be pretty confident going forward. So, I mean, of course there were like specific roadblocks in specific parts of the reporting, but there was never a moment where we were like, this story is not what we think, or is not worth doing.
Yeah. No, I mean, it was a kind of story that it keeps unfolding, and you think you sort of have a handle on all of like the main areas, and then you find out more and more and more. And so I think one of the challenges with the narrative is like how to shape all this, like how to put all of these findings in a way that is a narrative and makes sense to people. But yeah, I mean, that's like also the fun of reporting too, is this process of like you know what you're doing is, you think it's important to do it. Like you've picked something you think is important, you think there's something there, but you're open to whatever. And so you just don't know.
Yeah. I think somebody over here.
I was just wondering what you think, like when you start to think about the impact of what you're reporting, like when you start to think about, is Curtis going to go free because of what we're finding out, and is this prosecutor going to get fired, and like, because that seems pretty inevitable, I feel like.
There's no one to fire him. He can't be fired.
Oh, really?
They're
He's elected.
Yeah.
Official. Wow, that's not going to be great next November. Yeah, just wondering what you thought about the impact.
Well, I mean, we're always thinking about impact just in a general sense, because again, that's part of investigative reporting. As far as specific impacts,
and we don't control we put it out there, and whatever happens. Like we're not dictating the response that people should have to it, or like we're not policymakers, or citizens of the Fifth Circuit Court District or whatever the case may be. So it's like, we just put it out there. And then what we do hope, though, really strongly is that people hear the story. I mean, like, maybe the biggest editorial statement we could make is that we thought this story was important. And so if that's the case, then we want as many people to hear it. Because, I mean, with this story, it's true. Unlike a lot of stories that we've done, I mean, a person's life is actually on the line. And so it's a significant story. And so people can make of it what they will, but I do hope that people make something of it.
Here in the front.
Did you ever find a time in covering this case and reporting this where your team disagreed about the credibility of a witness fundamentally, or even about Curtis himself? And if so, how would you handle that in the reporting of the story, or even in treating that witness? I'm thinking in particular of this most recent episode. And in one particular witness, I don't want to say anything in case anybody, I don't want to say anything. I don't know if everybody's seen it. But even as a listener, I mean, even just through that one episode, I was kind of, and I'm wondering, as reporters, did you ever get into any battles about, listen, we can't, but someone, I don't know.
I want to know which witness.
But that's such a good question.
Should we play the clip? What I think you're talking about?
Does the witness sound like this? Yeah, I mean, I don't think, where we do have like a healthy debate is like in the writing, so there's all these decisions you can make where it's like, we're trying to portray people honestly and in a complex way too. I don't think we had.
I was trying to think if there were any particular people
I think we're always like deeply skeptical of everyone, basically. Yeah. So I think that's a general
don't believe
trait.
Anyone. Yeah.
But I think, I'm trying to. I don't think there was any. I mean, if you're talking about the first person in that episode who wants to renovate his lifestyle through $15,000 cash. No, like he didn't think he was no one thinks he's credible. He calls himself not credible. So there wasn't really a debate there. I mean, I think that, I don't think there was one where we, because if there had been, I mean, this gets to this issue, like if there had been that kind of debate, like that, like fact debate, well, is this person, we don't know enough about them, then we'd have to like report out to resolving it. So there are moments like, there are a couple of people in episode 2 who we interviewed more than once, like the man Bojack that we interviewed him several times. And so certainly like what we were trying to understand about like what he was saying in his life changed or not changed significantly, but we just didn't know a whole lot the first 2 hours we spent with him. They spend more time with him. So then, like Natalie and I, who are doing those interviews, kind of go back and forth, like, what should we ask him the next time? Like, what do we think is actually like underneath all of this?
I think there are facts that we see slightly different ways that I wish we could. There's like one in particular I'm thinking of that will come up in a later episode, so I'm not going to.
I don't know what it is.
It's an episode 8 thing. You know what it is.
Okay. I don't actually. I'm trying to think of it.
Where we might hear the same story and draw different lessons from it. Can't believe that you're not catching it.
I don't understand.
Well, we'll talk about this after
Okay.
It's for a later episode.
Talk about it now. We all want to know.
No, I mean, the biggest thing is
we
like
just talk it through.
Yeah, and also like because we're a bigger team, sometimes like there are whole interviews that only some of us were there for. So Samara interviewed one of the people in episode 4 and by herself, and so none of us were there. So everybody's like bringing their own perspective to things, and sometimes like, you sort of, to get like the sense of the person, you're going to defer mostly to the person who met them, so you're like asking that person, well, did they like, how did they, like, was this like a weird interview? Were they awkward? Or no, it was actually really friendly. Like, I know it seems like a little, but, or, whatever it is, you can kind of clear up that way. Mm-hmm. But it's also helpful to have this diversity on the team of like, I wasn't there, I was there. So you can kind of, be like, I think we should actually call them and ask this question too.
Over here.
Hi. I feel like there's really right now a cultural moment for true crime, whether it's your podcast or the Golden State Killer book or the Making a Murder on Netflix. Do you guys feel? Are you like aware that you're part of a larger cultural landscape? Is that something you think about? And like, what do you have any thoughts about what it means that we're all so fascinated by true crime right now, or at least everybody in this room?
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky because like, how would I say this? I mean, I think it's good that people are interested in the criminal justice system, and I think people can't be interested enough in the criminal justice system. So, like, if that sometimes gets called true crime, and I'm fine, but I mean, I think what we're really doing is reporting into the criminal justice system, and so. Because we're doing that in a podcast space, like, yeah, I mean, it's probably different than if we were like writing a book about it or something like that. But I do think like these like longer form like documentaries, books, podcasts, magazine articles that are like we're seeing a big resurgence of reporting in the criminal justice system. And so I see like our work is like hopefully like kind of fitting into that in some way. And so I think it's good that if, people are interested in true crime and then they like stumble upon a podcast like ours, which is like a little bit different than that maybe in some ways, that they will like be interested in it and stick with it. And that's what we found with like, we have really smart listeners.
Yeah. We have like generally an uneasy relationship with the true crime label because we do get like lumped in with that a lot, and we get a lot I'm sure a lot of our audience comes from that too, which we're grateful for. But yeah, like we think of our work differently. I mean, I think we made this point a bit in season 1, but like we're not focusing on the killer or like the criminal. Like our job is not to hold the criminal to account. It's like to hold elected officials or people who have power to account. And so that's it's a different way of thinking about the focus of the work. And if people who like true crime are into our podcast, that's great. But yeah, we definitely don't think of ourselves as true crime, even though we know that that's one of the labels that kind of gets applied.
Yeah.
Over here.
Hi. So granted, we're here and we're in New York City and we're listening and tuned in, but like the people of Winona and the people that you met, do you feel like they're following along with kind of how this is progressing, or do you have you heard feedback or feelings as kind of episodes have gone along? Yeah, I'd just love to hear more kind of about that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still in touch. I'm in touch with like a lot of people that are there, and they're definitely lots of people there are listening. And I think that, again, it really depends on who you're talking about. I think that there's a big sense of amongst the people who believe that he's innocent, or the people who believe that this was an injustice, who are really eagerly anticipating what the rest of the country will make of this. And so there's this feeling of like, this has been our burden for a really long time. What will what will everyone else think? Like when they know about Curtis Flowers and when they know about this prosecutor. So I think that is like the anticipation is really one of the main things. Like when I was in Winona the last time and I was going around, and one of the things I was doing was just kind of like telling people like really specific stuff, like here's how you download a podcast, like, or like this is like what it's gonna be like these days, or this kind of stuff. And that was really like one of the main things that people were saying was like, what do you think people are gonna make of it? Like I wonder what that's gonna be. And because this has been a story that has been mostly confined to this place. And yeah, so I would say that's most of it. I mean, I haven't heard anything negative at all from anyone I've interviewed, actually, about it. It's more just, wanting people to hear it. And, there's people who are interviewed in later episodes who are anxious to see what people make of those. And so, there's a lot of texts like, and like I'm really grateful too, because there's a lot of people who are helping like spread the word of this thing, this like medium that's like a little bit like uncommon still, I think. They think it's easy to be like, oh, everyone's podcast is not true at all, of course. And so it's like we have these kind of like boosters who are like telling all their friends about how to listen. And then the other thing we did too, which was really important, was we wanted to like figure out like how can we have this story reach people without making them like jump through all these hoops to like start listening to different types of medium just to find out about Curtis Flowers' case. So one of the things we did is we have worked with the Clarion Ledger, which is the largest paper in Mississippi, to publish articles about the Curtis Flowers case. So even if people aren't listening to the podcast, they can still find out about it. Yeah.
I think we had another one up here.
Hi. So I'm curious, I'm not sure I'm going to word this as well as I should, but the first series, obviously you didn't go into it thinking there was going to be necessarily a conclusion to it or like an answer that was as clear as it was, and that wasn't necessarily the point of your podcast anyway, which I thought was really impressively done. And I'm not sure how much knowing the answer made it clear to be like, I'm not worried about who did it. I know we're going to find out who did it, or I know I get told who did it. I can get to focus on the problems in the criminal justice system, and it kind of took that off the radar. And how did that affect kind of how you went into the second one? Because it's sort of like, it's hard to not watch it being like, but what's the answer? Like, whereas you got the answer in the first one. I don't know if we get the answer in the second one, but my assumption is, it can be ambiguous and still be about the criminal justice system, but it makes it harder on you guys. So I'm kind of curious, like, how that got navigated, both in how you did it in the first season and probably all the re-editing you had to do. I don't know how much stuff you had to do and when you found out, but.
Well, for the first season, so I don't know if for other people who've listened to this. So the first season was about this child abduction, and the question that drove all of the reporting of the first season was like, initially the question was, why hasn't this case been solved? And then the case was solved, and it became, why did it take so long, so many years to solve this case? And because that question drove the reporting from the very beginning, and when I say that it drove the reporting, I mean like literally it was written on the top of every document, every outline, every story pitch. Like, that question was just the frame for everything we were doing. And so because that was the case, the question was never who did this. And so once we learned who did it, the effect of that actually was just to make our reporting stronger, because all of a sudden we learned all of this stuff because we had been reporting it for so long. So we had all this knowledge, but we didn't know, if we couldn't say for sure who did it, we didn't know like which factors really mattered and which didn't, like which mistakes mattered, which mistakes didn't. And once we knew who the guy was, we could be like, this mistake was crucial. And we already knew about it, and we've already reported it out, and we know everything about it because we've already done the work. But now we can say, when we put it in front of the listeners, like, this was a really big deal. And so, yeah, it ended up making the reporting stronger. It did necessitate a bit of rewriting, but not as much as you might think, because the reporting was so driven by this other question. So it wasn't like we had to start over at all.
No. Yeah, it was really like, if you think about, like, there's an episode about this guy who's called a person of interest. And that episode was really just about strengthening, like, the writing around what he saw. Because it turns out, before we knew who did it and how they did it, there was some writing that was like, he could have seen the person who did it. He could have seen the car that he saw in his driveway, that could have been the person, versus it was the person, which is, of course, journalistically much stronger. So I think, like, another thing, too, is that we don't actually want there to be a lot of mystery about the facts and what we're doing. We obviously wanted the case solved, like, the way that every reasonable person would want that thing solved. And also, like, timing-wise, what was useful as a journalist is, like, to have that happen, although it happened, like a couple days before the first episode, because we were then able to, like, still have time to, like, go in and make those changes so that there wasn't, like, a second version or something like that, which was the stronger version or something like that. So, but yeah, it was a crazy moment too, because you're thinking about all the people that you've spent like a year with, and how, in all different types of ways, the person who's been wrongfully suspected of this, the family of Jacob Wetterling, the neighbors, law enforcement, and you have this like idea of all these people finding out this news. Yeah.
And for the second season, we also have a driving question, which is not who did this crime, or did Curtis Flowers do this crime. It's how could this happen that one person is being tried so many times over so many years for this crime. And so we're not anticipating any big breaking news in this case. But like, yeah, all the reporting is serving that question. Yeah.
Over here.
Hi. So I was wondering, since your goal of this podcast is to kind of, I guess, scrutinize officials and elected people, how do you navigate speaking with those people while holding them accountable and getting the information you need?
That's a good question. Depends on the person. So I always think, like, there's this term that gets used in journalism a lot I think is really unhelpful, which is this confrontation interview, which is just like an awful phrase, first of all. And there's this idea that, like, when you go to the person in power, like, your role is sort of to be like a prosecutor yourself, you know? Like, your job there is to, like, speak for the voiceless. You're like all these roles, you know, like all of a sudden, you know, but like really your job isn't any different from a regular interview. Like, you're there like to figure out what are the facts and give people a chance to explain them without like going in there like, I got to get this person to comment to this, to this, to this. Like, you go in with the same curiosity that you do in any other interview. And I think like one of the things that's worked for us a lot in reporting is people can tell that. I mean, depending on who it is, sometimes you just like strike out and the person won't talk to you. But like sometimes when you are talking to someone, like not just in interviews, but in regular life, you know, you can tell the person's not listening. And also you can tell that the person doesn't even care about what you have to say and already has their mind made up. And so I think like going into those interviews genuinely curious has been helpful and sort of disarming and unexpected, because we are wanting an actual conversation. Like, we are, like, to me, an ideal interview with someone who's responsible for the problems that we're exposing doesn't just like talk about the problems, but it gives you like an insight into how they make decisions, how they view the world, how do they see this, you know? And I think like in the end of season 1, I was very grateful to the sheriff for talking to me, because I felt like I left that interview thinking, not only did I tell him every last thing that was going to be in this, so I've done due diligence, but also I felt like I understood some things I hadn't understood before about how maybe this happened. And that was due to like the non-confrontational nature of it, and also due to the fact that when it wasn't confrontational, he was relatively, I think, generous in his responses. And at the end he said, like his big comment was that was way longer than I thought, because it was like 3.5 hours or whatever. Yeah. But so yeah, I think that's probably the main thing. I mean, on the other hand, the one slight difference is, of course, that if the person really is responsible, then like with any other person who's responsible, like you have to like let the facts be involved in the interview. So it's like if the person says, well, you know, I wasn't, you know, I don't know, I was like scared, so I didn't do this thing. You're like, well, okay, fine, but like still you should have done it or something, you know, like, so it's not like a soft interview, but it's like a question of trying to really understand something. And then when you're trying to understand something, then you can challenge someone a little bit and say, well, like, I don't understand that, because you just told me this and yeah, the facts are this. And hopefully you get somewhere with it. I think that approach is really unexpected amongst some of our interview subjects.
And Madeline is like leaving out the fact that she prepares for these particular kinds of interviews to the nth degree. Like you game these things out.
True.
You spend hours planning these, so it's not like she just waltzes in and is like, hey, I have some questions for you. Like, these are incredibly thought out strategy for approaching people, and then what to ask them and how to structure the interview. So you do a lot of work on the back end.
It's true. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah. So no, we record ourselves, like when we go up to, like we record ourselves always like in the car leaving, going, and you can sort of see like our own particular brand of like neurosis. It's like, you know, we're sort of even thinking of like small things, like what if the person isn't there, but they're going to come back in 5 minutes? Do we wait? You know, and then eventually you're like, is this strange, like to come on a Tuesday when we said we were going to come on a Wednesday, but we actually are leaving on a Wednesday, and so should we just go on a Tuesday? I mean, like people, like reporters are no different than the rest of the world. It's like we're doing a job, but also like there is somewhat of a strangeness to this whole idea of doing this. But then you just get, like, to me, like in those interviews, I don't go into those interviews until I'm ready for those interviews. And when you do that, then you're fine. To me, the challenge is like figuring out what is that moment. It's not too late in the process, but isn't too early either. Because what you don't want is like you go into an interview not knowing anything, and then you listen back to it and you're like, oh, if I had like been more familiar with the facts at that point, I really could have learned a lot more. Yeah.
I think there was over here.
This is more a question around the medium of the podcast. So I feel like when you finish an episode, you immediately want more. And the Netflix model is put them all out at once and let people binge on them. Would you guys ever like be open to that, or consider sort of changing the
Are
way
you
that
expressing a preference?
Well, yeah, it's and that's powerful, because then we are going to come back next time, like a week from now or whenever. Some podcasts might be later that day or the next day at the same exact time. But I don't know, like, what's your take on the binge verse sort of waiting?
We have a fairly practical answer to this, which is that like we weren't capable of, like, it wasn't all done, like production wise. So this is a theoretical debate that would never really had to happen. I mean, I think there's pros and cons.
Yeah, I mean, our reporting is essentially done, but as the podcast airs, like there's opportunities for as the weeks pass, there's opportunities for follow-up interviews, and so it's nice to have like the ability to have the process be a little more iterative.
And also like when we hear people's feedback, like there's some interesting questions like from episode 2 where we're like, oh, I thought that was super like I didn't realize that would be like a really interesting question people would have, which we can completely answer like in episode 8 or whatever. And so there's something that's a little helpful too about that. But yeah, it wasn't like a strategic, we're not like, we don't have them all done. They're just like sitting on them, hanging out.
If you guys are good, you can have one more episode. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions.
Hi. Do you have anything to share about confrontational interviews, like some technique or something that about your preparation or at that moment to catch the person, say what you need?
I think that my approach is, it really depends on the person. It's hard to say. I mean, like sometimes I will like, I don't normally like to just like walk in and be like, hi, here I am with a microphone, because that's like a little bit bizarre behavior. And then also, especially if you're trying to talk to somebody who's got a lot of information and you want to give them you want them to have really careful, considered conversation about it. You just want to like drop in one like day and be like, do you have 15 minutes? Other times, the person hasn't gotten back to you, so you're hoping that like a casual meeting. I mean, to me, like Samara was saying, like the single most important thing is the preparation, because you can think about, and also thinking about like what in the world would motivate this person to talk to me. And that's not true not just of the kind of accountability type interview, but also really anyone, like why in the world would anyone ever talk to a reporter? Like there are answers for that, but they're not the same. And I think it's like one thing that I have learned a lot from people who I really like their interview style is taking what the person is saying seriously and then playing it out. So like if someone says, well, this is how I always make decisions, like accept that premise and then ask them more about it, instead of saying, instead of challenging the premise or something like, okay, well, if that's true, then why did you do this? And then like you can get like more and more into their thought process. But I don't think that most people expect, like our interviews are not, like the interview with this sheriff was not an antagonistic interview. I mean, the interview, we didn't include it, but the interview ended with him like showing us around his office, showing us like some old photos of an old jail, and just like, because I think that, he just felt like, oh, that was an interesting conversation. Like he knew what it was about, but.
Yeah, I mean, they always feel very friendly, or they generally feel very friendly at the beginning.
Sometimes.
But I mean, these interviews are never like, right, they are never these gotcha moments of like jumping out from behind the door and like shoving a mic in someone's face and being like, why did you do this? Like, we don't do that. I mean, we try to be nice, but I was going to say unyielding. That sounded way too dramatic, but it's important.
But like
to
firm, like we're here
firm,
for a job, and we're not here like, oh, if you don't say hi to us, we're going to be sad or something. It's like, no. Like we're here as journalists, and we're going to try to get some answers here. And I think the difference too with elected officials or any kind of government officials, like, well, should be accountable to the public. So, it's a very different type of interview than, if someone declines to talk to you who was, is a private citizen who is involved in some matter and they just don't want to talk to you and you don't know why, that's one thing. But I think one of the reasons we do, like, that's a very different thing if that person declining is, an elected official or something like that. And for us, I mean, the type of stories we're doing too, because we're not like trying to get an interview with like a U.S. senator, or like we're trying to report on something that there's like a lot of people on already. We also have this advantage sometimes of like nobody's really ever asked anybody about this. And so there's actually never been a tough interview about this, even if the conduct is egregious. And so I think like some of the story selection plays into that too.
Yeah, and I think, again, getting back to the preparation thing, like I think you can sort of fake drama by having this moment where you're like yelling at your interview subject. Like that is something I think that maybe local TV news does sometimes. And that is drama, but it's like empty drama. Or you can have drama where you're just like in a very calm, friendly way, like presenting to this person actual facts. Like, this is what happened. This is what someone said to me. This is the numbers. This is the data. Like, let's just talk about it. Like, tell me why am I seeing this? Like, why does this happen? And I think that kind of drama can be just as like dramatic, but have a lot more there. Like, it's much more, I find it much more compelling because you're actually making someone answer for real things.
And you've created like a setting that seems sort of not comfortable, but sort of okay to express opinions in. Like the interview isn't really heated. So then like if things are just down a notch and you're like, here's like your clearance rates. And they're like, oh, I don't even know what those are. You know, it's like, it's very revelatory versus I'm going to barrage you with this and this and this. And but no, we do a ton of thinking about it. And then sometimes when an interview just goes really well and you think, I spent so much time, like I had like 45 alternate scenarios for this thing, you know, like I had like the cutting it off at the this, or like the receptionist comes and says, got a phone call, and none of these things happen, then you sort of feel kind of dumb. But then there are situations where you're like, I am so glad that I prepared for this turn, because not just psychologically, but fact-wise, like I've got some documents here that will address this. Like I expected this in some way.
Yeah, and just going in with the expectation that people will talk to you, which is this is like your mantra. It's like everyone will talk to me. Yeah, it's usually right.
It's like a thing. I don't know. I do practice it. I mean, because it's like a weird thing, journalism. Like it's very strange. So you have to get yourself in the mode of like, I'm doing this, like I'm visualizing success here. I'm gonna like ring the doorbell. They're gonna be like, so good to see you. Come on in. Like, do you have, like, I only have 5 hours. That is fine. Like 5 hours will be work for me. And they're like, do you need to come back tomorrow? Like, yeah, that'd be cool. Okay, well, like I can come, you know. So versus like getting yourself into this mode of like this like kind of anxious, hesitant, like, oh, what an intrusion I must be to do this, or what a bother. I'm going to apologize before I even ask a question. Like, and some of that is just like practice, I think, over time too.
Yeah, it was another advantage to being on the ground, I think, for so long, because it's like you just get into this rhythm of just like every day you go and you knock on doors, 1 million doors, and just like talk to people who've never seen you before, and just do it over and over and over again. And just like getting used to that interaction and really learning how to nail it.
Yeah.
It's a big part of it.
So before I let you guys go, I just wanted to ask if there are any current plans for a season 3?
We're accepting ideas. And no, we don't have a specific idea in mind. We're still finishing up season 2. I have a couple ideas, but nothing I've even shared with Samara yet. So.
Well, okay, I want to thank all of you guys for coming out, and I want to thank our guests. And I have to say, we are so excited to hear the rest of the season. This has been fascinating, and it's been really, really interesting hearing you guys talk about the process. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks. One little thing, if you like the music on In the Dark, Gary Meister, the man in the hat right there, the theme song creator of In the Dark, has joined us. Very grateful for his work.